Hello and welcome. We're here tonight to debate the question of Shakespeare's authorship, and a question which is so explosive and potentially radical that it's very rare for the academia, the groves of academe, to discuss it at all. So we are very honoured to have with us Sir Jonathan Bate, the preeminent Shakespeare scholar who will be making the case for the man from Stratford as the author of the plays and poems. Sir Jonathan is Professor of English Literature at Oxford University. He has published on Shakespeare and Ovid, on Shakespeare and his collaborators, on Shakespeare and the Romantics. He edited the Royal Shakespeare Company Complete Works, a monumental book as well as a bestseller of sorts, and his influence is such that his Arden edition in 1995 of Titus Andronicus totally revised our feelings about the play. He is going to really make his case for Shakespeare. And on the other hand, we have here Alexander Waugh in the red corner, the chairman of the De Vere Society, who is in demand around the world as a spokesperson for the theory that the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, was the author of Shakespeare's work. Waugh himself is also a distinguished editor of the 43 volume Complete Works of Evelyn Waugh, his grandfather. He is the author of such modestly titled books as God, Time, and also a biography of the Wittgenstein family. He is also the author of a very pertinent Shakespeare in Court, which is published on Kindle. And the two, I believe, are great friends and never discuss the Shakespeare question. They will each speak for 15 minutes, then they will rebut one another's arguments and answer each other's arguments, and then we shall move to questions from the floor. So I shall light the fuse and stand well back. Alexander Waugh.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. We're not actually here tonight, as far as I understand it. I haven't got it completely wrong. We're not here to discuss Edward de Vere or any other candidate. We're here to discuss whether the man from Stratford, William Shakespeare, as I'm going to call him, not to bait Jonathan, but I'm going to call him William Shakespeare to be clear, because it's very boring when people say, of course, Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to call him William Shakespeare. That's how he tended to think of himself, and so did his friends. And I'm going to say William Shakespeare when I mean the author, which I'm absolutely convinced is a pseudonym. And first of all, I would like to say thank you very, very, very much to Jonathan, actually, because it is wonderful that he's here. The English Literature Academy is a tight little group of people in America and England are very ferocious about this subject. They don't like it discussed, and I happen to know there are certain professors among them who are appalled that Jonathan has agreed to appear today. And Jonathan has put it on record that he says that academics must be challenged, and I completely support him in that, and it is absolutely wonderful that he's here. Now, just before everyone swans off thinking, oh yes, but he had such a wonderful introduction, Sir Jonathan Bate, he's handsome Jonathan Bate, he's all these things, and who's this scrofulous idiot on the other side? I just want to try and clarify a little bit here. English literature, if you study it at university, you do not study Shakespearean biography. What you study is a rather sort of creative criticism, usually using a lot of jargon that nobody understands. So I am not trying to demean Jonathan. I have a huge respect for people who study English literature, but I want it clear in everybody's heads that the study of English literature does not give you a monopoly over the question of who wrote Shakespeare. That is a question which belongs to historians who understand the concept of history and where things sit within a historical context. And of course it belongs to people whose life is spent studying evidence, and that is lawyers. And it's very difficult, in fact, to find a historian who is on the side of the Stratfordians. It is absolutely impossible to find a lawyer who is inside of the Stratfordians. And the reason is that they look at evidence and they understand evidence and they say this simply doesn't hold up. And what we find in America is the most extraordinary case where the highest lawyers in the free world, that is what are called the Supreme Court justices, all of those who have declared on the subject of William Shakespeare, every single one of them has says this does not hold up and we cannot support the idea that Stratford Shakespeare, as I'm now going to call him, wrote those plays. Now, people say to me, why do you know that William Shakespeare is a pseudonym? And the answer actually is very simple. We know it's a pseudonym because everybody at the time said it was a pseudonym. Now, this is the area where I get really vexed, actually, by the Englitters, because I've just said, you know, their skill set is not really about history, it's not about evidence, it's about reading texts. And this is where they could be really useful. But actually, it's taboo with Englit. It's absolutely taboo to discuss the matter of William Shakespeare's identity. I know 3 professors who are not allowed to print anything in the peer-reviewed journals because they don't agree with the case. I know 5, personally, I know 5 people who have done their English literature doctorates and were told by their mentors, if you mention the fact that you don't agree that William Shakespeare wrote these things, you will fail your doctorate. It's that bossy and ghastly. That's why I'm serious when I thank Jonathan for turning up today. It's a horrible little tight world of whipping and censorship and dogma. And so that's what we're trying to break out of. Now, what are all these people who are telling us that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym? Well, it's everybody at the time, and this is where the evidence lies. It's at the time. You have to look at the time. There's no interest in what anybody says in the 19th century or later than that. You have to look at the period when William Shakespeare of Stratford died. That's 1616, and within about a generation of his death. That's all that matters, and that's what we've got to look at today. Okay, so who are all these people who are saying it's a pseudonym? Well, they're saying it in a very slightly disguised way, and the reason they're doing that is because they get into huge trouble, and they'll in fact be pulled up in front of the Star Chamber if they're caught at it. So they say it a little bit subtly. So for instance, we have a fellow called Edwards, Thomas Edwards in 1595, and he describes Shakespeare as masking through. He calls him, and he's actually talking about obviously some quite high up person, because he's saying he's robed in purple robes disdained. He's someone who is a disgraced nobleman, and he's masking through. Now, what does masking mean? It obviously means he's in disguise of some sort. Now we get a man called Weaver, John Weaver, quite a famous epigrammatist and very good historian, and he calls Shakespeare a certain writer spurious. Well, we all know what spurious means. Spurious means not deriving or not proceeding from its recognized source. In other words, it's spurious means he's not the author. Weaver actually goes on in another poem to talk about William Shakespeare, and he says, "Oh, Shakespeare, I thought when I read your works that actually they were written by Apollo, not by you." Ooh. Well, of course, anyone in the day at the time, you just look up which contemporary playwright and poet is actually being referred to as Apollo, and you know quite simply who it is, and it's a little joke. And then we're getting a lot of these jokes that come through of people heavily suggesting that we're dealing with a pseudonym. There's a man called William Covell. Now, this guy I'm talking about, I don't really want to name him tonight, but there is a guy who was known as the Apollo of his day, the great sort of patron and playwright of his day. And this man, William Covell, he puts this man's name, he writes the name just like that, and then he squeezes in between it the letters of A secret, and then he puts a marginal note right by the side of it saying sweet Shakespeare. So he's telling you right there and then that this man is Shakespeare. Now, I'm writing a book at the moment which has all of the Shakespeare allusions in it with an American professor, who's one of these professors who were banned from the academy for having a slightly difficult view. And this fellow, he said to me the other day, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. It really is that easy. You pick up every single one of these things, and they're telling you that it's a pseudonym time and time and time again. But you will not find that in any of the books written by the academicians who are told that under no circumstances they're allowed to put it in there. So, for instance, we do not hear of a man who calls Shakespeare in 1636 that English earl who loved a play and a player. It's simply banned. I was on radio in America, so I'll give $1,000 in crisp notes to anyone who can find that in a standard biography of Shakespeare. It was used in a very early book of Shakespeare and Allusions and was whipped out ever since and been taken away. We have plenty of examples of that. We have a man called William Davenant, who in 1636 said, if you go to Stratford-upon-Avon in remembrance of Master William Shakespeare, your eyes will be mocked. He said, the only playwright you're going to find there is Fulke Greville, Lord Brooke, who had a house on the Avon. So, and I would like to just mention Ben Jonson, a very, very important person. He's wonderfully on one side, I'm pleased to say. The first folio of Shakespeare, which is 36 plays, published in 1623, so this is about 7 years after William Shakespeare of Stratford died. And Ben Jonson tells you, if you're going to read to the sense, as George Daniel of Beswick told you to do when you see a poem, read to the sense, don't just sit looking at the surface of it. What is he actually telling you? Ben Jonson writes a poem, and it says, to my beloved, the author, in huge, great big letters, Mr. William Shakespeare in tiny letters. What does that mean? Well, it's pretty obvious what it means. It means he thinks that the author is much more important than the name, and he confirms this the minute he starts his poem. He says, to draw no envy, Shakespeare, in brackets, on thy name. Now, how do you draw envy on a person's name? Very, very simple. You praise it. Now, what he's saying is he's not going to praise Shakespeare's name. He's refusing to do it. Why is he refusing to do it? Well, he's very kindly lays out the whole argument of why he's not going to do it. He says, because those of silliest ignorance will assume that what they hear, which is only an echo, is actually a direct sound. He says, those of blind affection will be sent groping in the darkness towards the truth. And then he says, and those of crafty malice will pretend to praise just so they can sink the poor fellow who actually wrote it. He goes on for 16 lines like this. Line 17, now I shall begin my Shakespeare rise. And now he's talking about the author. And of course he tells you that that author was writing plays in the 1580s, long before Shakespeare even had a little hair on his chin. And that he was... And he calls him Sweet Swan of Avon. And then, of course, what we have is the Ing Lit division comes in and says, oh, Sweet Swan of Avon, got it. Sweet Swan of Avon, that's Avon, that must be the Avon. There are 7 rivers called Avon. No, it's got to be the one in Stratford. No, it hasn't. Avon doesn't mean that. Avon, as any learned person in those days meant, it meant Hampton Court. Sounds peculiar, I agree with you, but that you'll find that in Leyland, and you'll find it in Camden, you'll find it in all the people, learned people of those days knew. Now, what does he say? Sweet Swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that so did take Eliza and our James. Where did Elizabeth and James go to the theatre? No, they did not go to the Globe, and they did not go to any of the public theatres ever. The most famous theatre, of course, was Hampton Court. And so what he's telling you, Ben Jonson, is that he's a courtier poet. And this is what Jonson's doing all the time. Now, we know Jonson wrote a poem which starts, if passenger... how'd it go? Jonathan might remember. If passenger, thou canst but read, stay. This is a poem written by Ben Jonson. What does it say on the Stratford monument to Shakespeare? Stay, passenger, read if thou canst. This is one of many, many examples that is telling us that Ben Jonson wrote the Stratford monument. Ben Jonson wrote the first folio. Ben Jonson wrote the Hemmings and Condell letters which appear in the first folio. And what I think we're going to hear, I don't want to jump what Jonathan's going to say, what I expect he's going to say is, look, Jonson says this. Look, Hemmings and Condell say this. Look, the Stratford monument says that. But they're all Ben Jonson. It's the same person. We have no evidence that Ben Jonson knew William Shakespeare in his lifetime. We have no evidence that William Shakespeare knew one single playwright during his lifetime. And this is a grotesque and complicated embarrassment. There's a man called Francis Mears, who in 1598 drew up a great list of all the great playwrights of his day. He said, these are the great people. Now you take those people out of that list, and put them together and look at the documentary record and find who actually knew whom at that time. Very quickly, you can find documentary evidence that Kidd knew Nash, that Nash knew, doesn't really matter, Nash knew Peele, Peele knew, and you can draw an enormous nexus from the documentary evidence of all the playwrights who knew each other. But there's one, the most famous one, right in the middle of the whole thing, and nobody knows who he is. Nobody. And then what this evidence is telling you, is absence of evidence is telling you very clearly that there was no one called William Shakespeare at the time walking around as a playwright. That, I think, is the fastest, most garbled attempt that I've given to do this. We only had 15 minutes, but I tell you, I'm going to sit down now, but I tell you, I have just shown you a glimpse of a damn wall, and what is behind there would flood the whole of this place with the vast amount of evidence that tells you that William Shakespeare is a pseudonym. Thank you.
Fantastic. Fantastic, thank you so much. We have there evidence of the taboo of Shakespeare denial. We have a vast amount of contemporary evidence, and really a beginning of a demolition of the first folio there, I think. That's very, very good. Thank you. I would call on Sir Jonathan Bate to make his case, if you please.
Thank you, Hermione. This is a debate. Now, the key to the spirit of debate is this. Are you prepared to change your mind? Do you believe in evidence-based argument? Or do you prefer coincidences, conspiracies, and cryptograms, hidden codes? I am here to speak for historical evidence, for truth, for fact. But in our post-truth world, I know that I will not persuade the believers in the fake news that Shakespeare did not write Shakespeare to change their minds. I will not persuade the cultists of Oxford who have put bits of paper on your chairs. Cultists allow emotion and wishful thinking to rule over evidence and common sense. I am here to address the agnostics among you. The true believers in the false story are a lost cause. But I'm rather fond of them. They add to the gaiety of nations, especially Alexander Waugh. Alexander is a dear friend, but you must know two things about the Waughs. Number one, they love to be contrarians. His father, Auberon, was one of our great contrarians. Number two, they love an aristocrat. Read his grandfather's novels. Now, here's the most important fact of tonight. Nobody for 240 years after Shakespeare's death expressed any doubt that William Shakespeare, the actor from Stratford-upon-Avon, was the author of the plays and poems. The first person to doubt it was a woman called Delia Bacon. She ended up in a private lunatic asylum. She thought that the author was Francis Bacon. Bacon? I wonder why she thought that. And then over the years, subsequent proposals came in. Among the dozens of candidates we've had, the first Earl of Salisbury, the second Earl of Essex, the third Earl of Southampton, the fifth Earl of Rutland, the sixth Earl of Derby, the seventh Earl of Shrewsbury, the eighth Lord Mountjoy, the 17th Earl of Oxford, the bastard son of the Earl of Hertford and Lady Catherine Grey, and not to mention Queen Elizabeth and King James. Everybody loves an aristocrat. Why, at some point in the 19th century, did people start thinking an aristocrat might have written the works of Shakespeare? Well, there's a simple answer to that. It was because serious biographical work about Shakespeare began to emerge in the late 18th century, and we found his life was rather boring. He made money out of his plays. He was shrewd enough, unlike the other playwrights who merely got paid on a piecework basis, he was shrewd enough to become a shareholder with the actors and take a share of the box office profits, and it allowed him to buy a big house back home in Stratford. Now, in the 19th century, the Romantic period, everybody wanted great authors to be glamorous. The most famous author of the age was Lord Byron. So they wanted Shakespeare to be a glamorous aristocrat like Lord Byron. Alas, though, he wasn't. The true story of Shakespeare is a story about how you can come from the middle classes and with a grammar school education, no university education. Shakespeare was much mocked for not having a university education. You can become a great writer. Right, let's begin with the facts. In the will of William Shakespeare, Shagsbird, people were very, very relaxed about spelling in those days. In the will of the man from Stratford, he leaves mourning rings to his friends, John Hemmings, Henry Condell, Richard Burbage, the leading actors of his acting company, the Lord Chamberlains, later the King's Men. On his tomb, he is described as a great writer, praised for his wit. He is said on his funeral monument in Stratford Church to combine the wisdom of Socrates with the art of Virgil. That monument was transcribed within a year of his death. It's alluded to in poems of praise. It's copied by pilgrims going to Stratford. From the 1620s onwards, people are going to Stratford saying, this is the home of the great writer. His monument, of course, shows him holding a pen and paper. Other writers in his lifetime praised him, spoke about his writing techniques. Ben Jonson, fellow dramatist. Shakespeare acts in many of Ben Jonson's plays. We have the cast lists of half a dozen Jonson plays, and Shakespeare's acting there. Jonson, when he goes north to meet the writer Drummond, talks about Shakespeare's writing techniques. He also does so in his private notebooks. Others too, Francis Beaumont, William Camden, John Davis of Hereford, Sir George Buck, Leonard Digges, Francis Mears, the Cambridge author of the Parnassus plays, they all talk about Shakespeare as a writer. Now the anti-Stratfordians will say, where then are his manuscripts? Why don't we have the manuscripts to prove the signatures that survive of William Shakespeare are the same? Unfortunately, no manuscripts of any of the 600 published plays by any authors from the period survive. Once a manuscript went to the printer either recycled it or threw it away. However, a tiny number of theatre manuscripts survive because they were of plays that weren't performed. One of those was a collaborative play, collaboration in the theatre. Then, as in television and film now, the art of writing was a collaborative art. Collaboration was the norm. Shakespeare contributed a scene to a collaborative play about the life of Sir Thomas More that was banned because it was too politically sensitive. And handwriting experts have looked at the hand in that manuscript, and I've held it in the British Library, and found 6 particular features of handwriting, which they've then compared with Shakespeare's signatures and with the handwriting of 250 other writers from the period, and there are 6 features that only match Shakespeare's. Letters, people say, why don't we have Shakespeare's letters? Well, we do have a couple of Shakespeare's letters. They were appended to his poems which made his name Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece, and they are rather servile. They are saying, please give me patronage, my lord Southampton. The idea that an earl like Oxford, one of the great earls of the land, would have written these servile, flattering letters to a mere junior aristocrat, a 20-year-old whippersnapper like Southampton, is inconceivable. The theory about Oxford having to, or some other aristocrat, having to write under a pseudonym because they were worried about being associated with the theatre is frankly bizarre. The Earl of Oxford was patron, sponsor of a theatre company, Oxford's Men. They toured in the provinces in the 1580s and 90s. If Oxford was proud of involvement with the theatre, why didn't he write the plays for Oxford's Men? If he was ashamed, then why did he have an acting company? We hear that Shakespeare's father was illiterate. It's funny then that there's a will in which someone leaves him some books, a strange thing to leave to an illiterate man. Why were there no books in Shakespeare's will? Well, look at the wills of Heywood, Beaumont, Fletcher, Massinger, Middleton, Webster, Ford, Marston. There's no books in any of their wills. People didn't, on the whole, specify books in their wills. Now, one of Alexander's big arguments is that the person who wrote the plays must have gone to Italy, because there's lots of detail about Italy in the plays. Those would be the plays where two of them are set in Venice and there's no single mention of a canal. There are certain details about Italy that seem to be authentic, but equally Ben Jonson never went to Italy, and yet in Volpone he knows the location of the portico to the Procurata. John Webster never went to Italy, yet in The Duchess of Milan he knows the location of a lane behind St. Mark's Church. You can pick up knowledge from books and conversations. We might just as well say, how did Shakespeare know about the details of the platform at Elsinore in Hamlet? The answer would be that three of his fellow actors in the acting company, Bryan, Pope, and Kemp, went to Elsinore and told him about it. The Earl of Oxford never went to Elsinore. How could this humble middle-class boy from the grammar school have known so much about aristocratic households? According to John Dryden, a 17th century writer much closer to aristocratic households of the time than we are, he writes that Shakespeare understood very little of the conversation of gentlemen. Shakespeare was actually pretty useless at representing what aristocratic households with hundreds of retainers were really like. Just have a look at Romeo and Juliet, where the character of Capulet, leading aristocrat, his daughter's about to be married to Paris, a kinsman to the prince. He's down in the kitchen speaking to the staff. No, that sort of thing didn't happen. Shakespeare didn't know about Italy. He didn't know about aristocratic households. What did he know about? He knew about wool trading and leather manufacture. His father was a glove maker. The plays refer to calfskin, sheepskin, lambskin, foxskin, dogskin, deerskin, kidskin, neat's leather, leather for a bridle. Shakespeare was above all a countryman. Look at the countryman in The Winter's Tale, speaking about tods yielding pounds and shillings for wool. This is countryman's language. 600 plays from the period survive. The only ones that mention Warwickshire and Gloucestershire are those by Shakespeare. There's a little problem for the argument about the Earl of Oxford writing Shakespeare. He died in 1604. A large number of Shakespeare's plays were written thereafter. In the plays that Shakespeare wrote in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, he always talks about England because she was Queen of England. In the plays that he wrote for King James, after James came to the throne in 1603, he wrote about Britain because King James wanted to unite England and Scotland into Britain. Macbeth, King Lear, and Cymbeline are specifically linked to the Jacobean project. Similarly, in 1608, Shakespeare's acting company acquired an indoor playhouse so that instead of acting outside in natural daylight, they had to have candles. So in his late plays, he starts introducing act divisions, the 5-act structure, so there's a break so the candles can be replaced. Oh, that Earl of Oxford was a clever chap. He realized that 4 years after his death, there would be an indoor theatre, so he must have written some plays like The Winter's Tale and The Tempest with act breaks just preparing for it. And then, most interestingly of all, at the end of Shakespeare's career, he's got to decide who's going to take over as the leading playwright of the acting company. And he chooses a young dramatist called John Fletcher, who came onto the scene in 1607. And Shakespeare's last 3 plays, The Two Noble Kinsmen, Henry VIII, and the partially lost play Cardenio, are co-written with Fletcher. For 150 years, scholars have been able to identify the different linguistic fingerprints of Shakespeare and Fletcher. Shakespeare says you, Fletcher says ye. Shakespeare says them, Fletcher abbreviates to M''em. Feminine endings, an unstressed syllable at the end of the line. Very different patterns in Shakespeare and Fletcher. So we know, as Shakespeare and Fletcher sat down to write Henry VIII and Two Noble Kinsmen together, which scenes were Shakespeare, which were Fletcher's. I'm struggling to imagine how Oxford did that from beyond the grave, let alone how he collaborated with Fletcher in the play of Cardenio, which was based on Don Quixote, 1605 after Oxford's death, and indeed has allusions to the 1612 English translation. I still want to celebrate the work of the anti-Stratfordians and to thank them, because there is a long history whereby forgery and fiction has assisted the work of true scholarship, because we get asked hard questions as scholars, and we have to find better answers. So there were two very interesting scholars in California called Eliot and Valenza, one a statistician, one a computer scientist, who became convinced that Shakespeare couldn't have been Shakespeare. But they developed well-established techniques of linguistic fingerprinting. Everybody has their own linguistic fingerprint. The little turns of phrase, the little choices we all make. And they ran through their computers not only the entire corpus of surviving drama of the period, Shakespeare's plays, but also the surviving writings of the Earl of Oxford and all those other candidates. And they came to the conclusion that it is a mathematical certainty that none of those other candidates could have written the work of Shakespeare. But thanks to those advances in stylometric study, we now know things we didn't know before. For instance, we know when Shakespeare early in his career wrote Titus Andronicus, he collaborated with George Peele. And we know that because Peele used brethren as the plural of brothers, and Shakespeare used brothers. And we know from that Peele wrote the first act, Shakespeare the rest. So it's something to be celebrated that we have these debates, because eventually the truth will out.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sir Jonathan Bate. We have here the vivifying effect of the counter-argument. We have plenty of evidence of Shakespeare's own handwriting, identified as hand D on the text of Sir Thomas More. The counter-argument often portrays Shakespeare as illiterate, so I'd be interested to hear the response to that, to the response to the Warwickshire dialect in the verse, and so many other... there was a mention of, there's moments for questions from the floor will come afterwards, please. But there was a point about dialect, and there was a point about stylometrics and the monument in Stratford. Thank you,
okay,
Alexander Waugh.
Look, I'm sorry, don't clap, because we haven't got time. There's so much here that's wrong, and we haven't got very much time, and I'm in a pother because I felt it was quite rushed, the 15 minutes, and there were lots and lots of things I wasn't able to put in, so I'm grateful to John, and it's always good to start with thank yous, for all the things that he didn't mention that I never even said anyway, saying about Italy. Of course, Italy is a major problem. We have Shakespeare plays based on Italian works by Cintio and Bandello, and works that were not translated into English, and somehow this amazing person managed to read Italian and managed to read French, because, Hamlet's based on a French thing by Bella Forest. We have all these absolute knowledge of the fact that he's using foreign things. And so thank you for bringing that up. It is a problem for the Stratfordians, and it should be. Now, shall I go through some of the errors, or shall I? Look, my notes are everywhere now. Just a few errors. Right, what did Jonathan say? On his tomb, he's praised as a great wit. No, he's not. It's as simple as that. It's very interesting. I said it's by Ben Jonson, that tomb, and the tomb is really clever, because it's Jonson wants you to read to the sense, and Jonson is very guilty, and he writes about what he's done about Shakespeare, and he says, I've let people think things that came from me, and it was wrong, and literature's being misunderstood. And he actually says, in this great sort of weeping statement before he talks about Shakespeare the actor, he says, accuses himself really of being guilty of idolatry, the setting up of false idols. Jonson's a wonderful person, and he didn't get these things wrong. He didn't praise Shakespeare as a great wit, and anyone who's read the Stratford Monument will see exactly what Jonson's doing. He's being very clever and very funny. First thing he's doing is he's telling you that the real Shakespeare is actually buried in Westminster Abbey. The second thing he's doing is saying that Shakespeare of Stratford, the only thing he's got is this enormous name that is worth so much, worth more than cost, he says. And it's just the title page. He's worth but one page. That's all that Shakespeare stands for. Okay, listen, what did Jonathan say? Nobody expressed doubt about Shakespeare before what did you say?
Julia Bacon,
Absolute
1850.
absolute nonsense. 1838, John Dowdall, History of Shakespeare and Warwickshire, rails against those who, and I quote, had the hardihood to question Shakespeare's identity. 1786, there's a whole book published saying that poaching story was absolute rubbish, and then he goes on to say, with equal falsehood has he been fathered with many spurious dramatic pieces, Hamlet, Othello, As You Like It. I could go on and on. 1796, The Thief of All Thieves was a Warwickshire feast. 1759, Townley, Shakespeare, who wrote it? Why, Ben Jonson. 1728, Golding, in all probability Shakespeare could not write English. It's just absolute rubbish to say that started. I'm sorry, Jonathan, but it's absolute rubbish. And anyway, it's irrelevant to the argument. And this is what my worry is, that this is how this argument happens. We get shifted away. We're here to talk about whether Stratford Shakespeare could wrote those plays. We haven't even discussed whether he could even write. Now, we're told that on the will he has these wonderful signatures. No, he doesn't. Those signatures are highly contested by people who have looked at them. Jane Cox, who was the head of Renaissance manuscripts at the National Archives, put it on record saying that these are all done by different hands. They are all spelt differently. They all look different. And then he said that some manuscript called Thomas More, oh yes, it's absolutely definitely Shakespeare's hand, because we're using a control sample of some debated signatures. Now, come on, I don't need to be talking to a room of paleologists here to understand that you cannot have a control sample of signatures that are debated anyway, which are 20 years later than this thing they're saying is by Shakespeare of Stratford. And anyway, there are no dots on the I's on that one, there are on that, and the B is completely different on that. And you haven't been reading, Jonathan, I'm sorry, but you have not read all the latest literature on this. There's a huge article in the absolutely Stratfordian book, which is called the Shakespeare Quarterly by Michael L. Hayes, which completely rubbishes this idea that that's by him. There was a huge article in Renaissance English Studies lately by Diana Price, completely rubbishes it. It's finished, that argument about the Thomas More manuscript. I'm sorry. Oxford wrote under a pseudonym. You say there's no evidence that Oxford wrote under a pseudonym. Again, this is just simply, you're just not knowing the fact. There's a man called John Bodenham who in 1600 wrote a book in which he says that the Earl of Oxford's works appear under other people's names. They are published under other people's names. I'm not here to argue about the Earl of Oxford. Now, what was all this thing about candles you started saying? Oh, Shakespeare started writing 5-act plays so that you could have a candle break because the candles didn't last. I mean, look, neither of us are candle makers, but we all know that you can have a candle this big that lasts for 14 years if you want to, or a little one that lasts 10 minutes. I mean, it's absolute rubbish. And there is no evidence at all, there is not a single piece of evidence in Shakespeare's lifetime that one Shakespearean play was performed at the Blackfriars Theatre, which he says is where he changed all his view of how to write 5-act comedies. Can I just remind you, Jonathan, of the plays that Shakespeare wrote in 5 acts before the Blackfriars Theatre was built? The Comedy of Errors, Romeo and Juliet, Richard II, Much Ado About Nothing. Come on, 5-act plays. John Lilly was writing 5-act plays in 1580. 5-act plays are the standard form that we inherited from Seneca and from Plautus. I mean, it's the most famous thing to say. He suddenly wrote 5-act plays because the candle was going to burn out. I just can't, I really can't deal with all this. Now, what else do you write? Italy. I mean, I've dealt with Italy. Nobody, I've said that. A huge number of, I've said that. Look, come on. Guys, I think Jonathan and I both agree that this debate needs a lot more time. And this is the frustration I'm feeling this evening. I'm enjoying it. It's fun. I'm glad you're all here. But honestly, to get through all of this stuff which is wrong, it takes a serious sit down. And I'm going to sit down now, but I'm going to say to everybody who's remotely interested in the subject, please go on the internet, please look up the facts, and you'll find very quickly that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym. Thank you.
Well, Alexander has said some very curious things. I mean, just going back to those early plays, if you look at how they were printed in the quarto, they do not have a 5-act structure. They have a scene after scene after scene. The 5-act structures were imposed retrospectively in the first folio. As for the signatures, nobody has ever questioned Shakespeare's signature on the deposition on the Bellot Mountjoy case, a law case of 1612, which has a distinctive way of writing the letter A without finishing the curl of it so it looks like a U, which is exactly like a feature in the manuscript of Sir Thomas More. And Giles Dawson, one of the world's leading handwriting experts, has examined 250 Elizabethan hands, including Oxford's and many others, and none of them have that. And what is more, there are several misprints in Shakespeare's printed plays that come from the result of the compositor, the printer, reading his A as a U because of that particular handwriting technique. Now, these things that Alexander has said, they're full of conspiracies and misreadings. This idea that Cavell, William Cavell, covertly mentioned the Earl of Oxford, it's nonsense. If you look at the context of what he writes there, it's in a letter, a published letter praising the universities of Cambridge and Oxford. When he talks about Oxford, he's talking about Oxford University, and he says, as Cambridge's greatest writer is Edmund Spenser, so Oxford's greatest writer is Samuel Daniel. And then what he does in the margins is he puts the names of a bunch of also-rans, writers who were not the greatest writers from Oxford or Cambridge, but still are to be praised. I think the main point I want to make about the anti-Stratfordian fallacy is that although Shakespeare's plays were admired in their time, they were not uniquely admired. Johnson was admired as much. Beaumont and Fletcher were admired as much. Many other dramatists as well. Even after the restoration of the theatres, Beaumont and Fletcher's plays were put on twice as often as Shakespeare's. Why is it that people don't want to say, aha, Ben Jonson didn't write the works of Ben Jonson, or Fletcher didn't write the works of Fletcher? What I hate about the idea that an actor could not have written the plays is that it seems so counterintuitive to the way that we all know that theatre works. Theatre works collaboratively. Shakespeare was a member of the acting company, writing plays for particular actors in the company, and writing collaboratively at the beginning and end of his career. So this idea that this aristocrat sort of swans in and sort of says, oh, here it is, you silly actors, you just perform it. That's not how theatre works. It's a grave disrespect to the theatre to think like that. As I say, there are many other great writers in the period. And Alexander said in his talk that he does not know of any historians of the period who are Stratfordians. I don't know of any historians of the period who are anti-Stratfordians, apart from one, a man named William Rubinstein, and he's not a believer in the Earl of Oxford. So I think we do need to take everything that Alexander says with a very large pinch of salt. But I agree with Alexander, go to the internet. In particular, go to the site called Oxfraud, which gives you 102 reasons why Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare and the Earl of Oxford didn't.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to say that we have the results of your entrance poll. The votes were cast thus: that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, we have 78 believers. That someone else wrote Shakespeare's work, we have 107 votes, and don't know, 86. So it is these 86 that we are most interested to watch, perhaps, which way they might move after this brilliant debate. We also would be interested to break down the someone else vote. Could I hear perhaps a response vocally for who here might think that somebody else would be Sir Francis Bacon?
About that.
No, okay.
We're talking about Shakespeare Stratford. I'm not trying to be...
Can
we concentrate on Shakespeare
No, I'm glad to know that the feeling from the audience is very focused on
Shakespeare.
Shakespeare versus Shakespeare. So we will continue if we don't have any strong feelings. That's brilliant to know, because at this point we're going to throw the debate open to the floor, and I would like to take questions. Thank you. Sir.
Sir Jonathan twice referred to Shakespeare as, thank you, I wouldn't even shout now, as having received a grammar school education. As I understand it, this is based on the following. Shakespeare must obviously have been educated. Shakespeare lived in Stratford. There was a grammar school in Stratford. Therefore, Shakespeare went to Stratford Grammar School.
Thank you, Stratford Grammar School.
I would like to hear what actual evidence there is that Shakespeare went to Stratford or any other school.
Thank you.
Simple answer to that is that John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's father, was on the town council. He became Chamberlain of Stratford, and members of the town council were entitled to send their children to the grammar school for free. Also, there is a funny little scene in Merry Wives of Windsor which precisely, but comically, portrays a lesson in a grammar school with a Welsh schoolmaster. It happens there was a schoolmaster of Welsh origin when Shakespeare was at Stratford, just as another of his schoolmasters was a man called John Brownsword, who was a rather distinguished Latin poet. And in that, the little boy who's a bit cheeky is called Will. It's the most autobiographical moment in Shakespeare.
In other words, there is no evidence that Shakespeare was...
Yeah, correct.
No, there is evidence. It is true that the role is lost from the period. The role of who were the boys in the school is lost. But there is no confuting the fact that John Shakespeare, his father, was on the town council, and that members of the town council were entitled to send their children to the school for free.
It could have happened. And do you want to comment on the grammar school?
Well, there's no record that Shakespeare at Stratford had any education at all, either at university or there. Now, he possibly was at the Stratford Grammar School. I'm not going to say he wasn't, I'm not going to say he was. But, of course, what happens with these opportunism, when you're decided that Shakespeare Stratford, then, of course, he has to have been there. But there is no evidence. So, and just a second, Jonathan, when you look at the absence of education, the absence of his having written anything, the absence of anyone saying that he's written anything, the absence of his family don't say he's a writer, he never says he's a writer, all this line of 0, 0, 0, 0, nothing, and compare it to every other writer of his day where they've got some big evidence, Diana Price did a good study on this, then you realize that the 0 for the most famous writer on all these most important points is evidence of something.
No,
I'm sorry,
Alexander, it's exactly the opposite. I mean, someone like his neighbour Leonard Digges talks about him as a writer. In fact, there is nobody...
No, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. Please don't say wrong stuff, because it muddles people.
Who says,
he doesn't do that, no.
There is nobody who says Thomas Hayward was a writer. There is nobody who says John Webster was a writer.
Nonsense. Absolute nonsense.
So who says Thomas Hayward is a writer?
John Webster, you go to Henslow's diaries, and he's saying, I'm paying John Webster for writing a play in the Henslow's diaries. He says it. I'm sorry. But he's paid for writing a play. That's contemporary evidence that Webster is a writer. We don't have any problem with that. We have a problem with William Shakespeare, the most famous writer of the lot, where we have no evidence that he was a writer in his lifetime. It's a big prob. Sorry.
Thank you, sir.
My impression of this discussion, and I'm very pleased it's taking place, is that from an outsider's point of view, and I'm not an outsider, I'm an Oxfordian, but if I'm listening with an outsider's ears, neither person putting the cases has scored a knockout punch. And in the light of this, I would like to ask you both, but particularly you, Sir Jonathan, are we moving towards an epoch where in the discussion of this question, both parties will be able to take each other's discussion seriously and forego the ad hominem attacks that have so characterized this whole business on both sides? Are we moving into an epoch of discussion where a degree, if you like, of agnosticism on both sides may become possible?
I think I can say with a good conscience, I have only ever once made an ad hominem reference in this whole debate, which was with reference to an anti-Stratfordian who was also a Holocaust denier. And that seemed to me a matter of where it was important to be ad hominem. But other than that, I don't think I've ever been ad hominem, because I believe passionately in the importance of truth and of historical evidence. But I do worry that...
What did you say about Alexander? How about his father and his grandfather? He talked about his grandfather. Have you any idea what that
But what I was saying there is that we love the wars because they are contrarians.
We do,
And
indeed.
because they love aristocrats.
There's a question coming from the rear.
Yes, could I just ask for some clarity on a point that the Earl of Oxford died in, before a number of Shakespeare plays were written? Just answer that point directly, please.
Who is this addressed to?
Well, either, well, I know.
We'll start with
I guess.
Alexander. Would you address directly the point about the date of death of the Earl of Oxford?
Yes, but with a heavy heart. I'm here to discuss Shakespeare of Stratford and whether he wrote those plays. I've said to the organisers of this event that if the motion is carried tonight, I'm very happy to come back with Jonathan and argue the case for the Earl of Oxford. I'm also told the organisers tonight that I've made this sensational discovery, which is the Earl of Oxford is buried directly underneath the monument in Westminster Abbey to William Shakespeare, and I'm prepared to give this society the very first look at that extraordinary unpublished evidence. I'm not really wanting to stand here now and defend the Earl of Oxford, but believe you me, I'm not so stupid, and no Oxfordians are that stupid, that if it were proven that any Shakespeare play were written after 1604, of course we wouldn't be Oxfordians. So there's quite clearly a very strong argument that that's wrong, and I don't want to enter into it now.
What is it? I mean, I do find Oxfordians are oddly quiet about the Fletcher collaborations and the clear stylometric evidence of Two Noble Kinsmen and Henry VIII as being two writers working very close together. What is the Oxfordian position on the Fletcher collaborations?
The Oxfordian position is extremely clear. That Oxford wrote an awful lot of plays. We know perfectly well, if we actually read Hayward's apology to the actors, that we know that the court plays are being constantly revised and updone and made topical, and we know that in Shakespeare's case. Oxford died in 1604, and it is very, very obvious that his plays were absolutely brilliant, and that people like Middleton and people like Fletcher, who were the big cheeses in those days, were told, come along, chaps, let's get this out. And actually, if you read again, reading to the sense, Jonathan, which I ask you to do, read the prologue of Two Noble Kinsmen that was published in 1634 as by Shakespeare and Fletcher, and see what he's really saying, because the Stratfordians, again, they're lazy about this, and they think they're just talking about Chaucer. He's not. He's talking about the dead Shakespeare, and he's saying, I really hope the dead Shakespeare isn't upset that I'm revising this thing. Look at it, read it carefully, and you'll understand exactly the Oxfordian point of view.
You should also, by the way, everybody, read some of the Earl of Oxford's surviving poems. They're really terrible.
Notice how this is being dragged. They're beautiful, and that's beautiful poems. I mean,
Bombshells,
absolutely
bombshells
beautiful
everywhere.
poems.
First of all, the revelation about Westminster Abbey, because at present the Earl of Oxford is thought to have been buried in Hackney, is that right?
Well, there are two accounts. There are two accounts. We have a thing saying he's buried in Hackney, and we have his first cousin saying he is buried in Westminster. So I've now resolved it, and I know exactly where he's buried. It's really, really exciting.
It is exciting.
And I'll come and show everybody here if they want to come back.
May I have a question here? Thank you.
I wondered if I could ask Sir Jonathan and Alexander to speak about the sonnets, which have always struck me to be something very raw and personal. And I may have misunderstood you, Jonathan, because I've heard you talk about them being a technical exercise, and that we must be wary to look back on that period of writing with modern ideas of how poets write. But in my experience of poets, those poems cannot help but betray something personal in the way you've acknowledged the biographical detail of young Will with his schoolmaster. But could you speak about the authorship of the sonnets for a moment? Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and a great place for it to come from. This is a really, really tricky question, because if you look at what people say about sonnet writing in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, and every writer had a batch of sonnets, it was something you had in your repertoire, you will find that some people describe sonnets as a form of exercise, a form of fantasy. If Giles Fletcher, not John Fletcher, Giles Fletcher sort of says, who is my beloved in the sonnets? It might be a real person, it might not. It might be the spirit of poetry itself I'm addressing. So, but then on the other hand, there is no doubt that many sonnet sequence do seem to arise out of particular circumstances. So there is a mystery around Shakespeare's sonnets. There is still a debate as to whether when they were published in 1609, they were authorized or unauthorized. And obviously there's an element of scandal that potentially attached to them. When they were reprinted in 1640, the gender of some of the sonnets addressed to the lovely boy was changed. They were addressed to she instead of he. My gut instinct, any writer at some level makes use of their experience, but what great art is about is transforming experience into art. My gut feeling is that Shakespeare did have what I would describe as a bisexual imagination, and that the sonnets are in many ways reflecting that. But the sonnets are above all debates about the complex nature of love, and in particular the sort of the tension between the idealizing spiritual aspect of love, which is projected onto the lovely boy, and the more erotic and sexual aspect of love projected onto the dark lady. What fascinates me about the sonnets, and where I think I find the greatness of the sonnets, is in the way that you get drawn into them. And although they very, very rarely seem to mention names, for example. I mean, they do at one point say, my name is Will, which maybe suggests that the person who wrote them was called William. But unlike other sonnet sequences of the time, they don't give the name of the beloved. They're very mysterious in that regard. And I mean, I have to say, we talk about agnosticism. I am still agnostic as to whether some of them were written for the patronage of the Earl of Southampton and some for the Earl, for William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, or whether they were all for Southampton or for Pembroke. There is a mystery about them, and that's where, I mean, this is where, to come back in a way to the question about whether we can have a debate. Where we can certainly have a debate is we can recognize that there are gaps and uncertainties around many aspects of Shakespeare's life, but so too there are around the lives of so many other writers of the time.
I must throw this wonderful question, thank you so much, to Sir Mark Rylance. It's absolutely brilliant to have a great actor here this evening, and I must offer the question about the anti-Stratfordian view of the sonnets to Alexander Waugh.
Thank you. I mean, the sonnets, as everybody here probably knows, are 154 poems which are linked by theme, and they're written in the first person. Generally speaking, the Stratfordians run away from them. They're absolutely terrified of them because the first person is obviously quite a sort of a courtier who's addressing another courtier. But I'm going to confine my remarks on the sonnets now to the question that we're here to debate. Is William Shakespeare a pseudonym? Now, I've given you a great number of contemporaries who say, yes, it is a pseudonym. We haven't actually heard from William Shakespeare himself. And he tells you that really that it's a pseudonym in those sonnets. If you follow the theme that he's talking about, his name and his person, he says, if you read this line, remember not the hand that writ it. In me each part will be forgotten, my name be buried where my body is. As Jonathan knows better than anyone here, because he's written a brilliant book on it, Shakespeare was obsessed by Ovid and this idea that you metamorphose, you actually turn, you disappear and turn into your works. Now, he's just brought out this subject, absolutely crazy, saying that Shakespeare says in the sonnets, my name is Will. Now, Jonathan, I know, is so sensitive and so understanding of Shakespeare, even though he's got the wrong fellow, but to suggest that a poet of Shakespeare's stature would write a line as fatuous as my name is Will is completely bonkers. Is it possible that Marlowe would write a poem saying my name is Chris? Is it possible that Tennyson, my name is Alf? Or Spencer, my name is Ed. No, it's not happening, and you have to look at this in context. And again, it's very weird that I'm having to tell a major person who understands English literature how to look at this thing in context. Now, what does Shakespeare say? He says, my name is Will, and then he says, and my will one, and among a number, one is reckoned none. then in the number let me pass untold. I am very pleased to be able to say that of all the people I've brought forward to say that Shakespeare is a pseudonym, it's very good to have the man himself making it that plain. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's just to say my name is, it's so fatuous. Is it almost as fatuous as that poem which goes, I, Ben, John, across the line, and Son, I, Ben, Johnson?
Yes, this is fatuous.
But he did write I.
Yeah, but Ben Jonson isn't Shakespeare. You've got to understand that.
Thank you. At the back.
There's a lot of discussion about Oxfordians and Stratfordians, and yet you don't want to say exactly who you think he is if he isn't the Shakespeare that we think he is. So could you, Alexander, talk to us a bit more about the Earl of Oxford?
I'm sorry I didn't see the lovely questioner, but lovely voice, very pretty. I've made it plain. I'm not here to talk about the Earl of Oxford. I will come back and I will talk about the Earl of Oxford, and I guarantee that I will convince an audience of this size that I'm correct about who wrote this. But I'm not here to talk about this. We're trying to talk about William Shakespeare of Stratford. Was he a writer or was he not? And so far we haven't heard any good evidence that he was, and there's nothing from his lifetime saying he was, and it's highly improbable and implausible, the evidence that they've got. I'm sorry.
Thank you. We have questions at the front, please. Yeah, thank you. And one here. One here. Thank you.
If William Shakespeare of Stratford, who was born and baptized as Shakespeare, who was married as Shakespeare, who died as Shakespeare, had 3 children who were baptized as Shakespeare, who had 7 brothers and sisters who were all baptized as Shakespeare, if he was the writer of the plays, are you not saying that he was actually using a pseudonym himself?
That's a lovely question, but no, because the point was people were very erratic in the spelling of their names at that time. He himself was. Look. No, he was. Look. I'm not going. Look at you. You need to look at his signatures. Let's look again at that will. Let's ask ourselves why in that will he is leaving mourning rings to John Hemmings, Henry Condell, and Richard Burbage.
Answer that.
Alexander.
It's incorrect. It's incorrect what you've just said. People were actually very precise about the way names were spelt. And you look at someone like Walter Raleigh, and his name is spelt 4 different ways during his life. And what they're doing is it's like differencing in a coat of arms. So, in fact, there's Walter Raleigh, spelt as we're used to spelling, and that was what his great-grandfather saw. When his great-grandfather died, he moved up a line. Now, we have this with Edward de Vere, who we've been talking about, so that the actual holder, the head of the family, will spell it in a particular way. So, in fact, what you're saying, it's actually very, very indicative that there is a problem, that Shakespeare spelling. But more than that, and I think something we haven't actually touched upon tonight, is that Shakespeare, the writer, has a hyphen in 45% of those quartos. 5 times it's hyphenated in the first folio of 1623. Shake-Spear. Now the man from Stratford never used that, and he wouldn't. I mean, it's an absurd idea. If you're called Ramsbottom, you don't say Rams-bottom. It's silly. But obviously what's going on here is that Shake-Spear is, I'm afraid to say, it's a very obvious pseudonym, because it refers to Pallas Athena, who was the patron goddess of playwrights, as we are told by Stubbs in 1583, as we are told by Gosson in 1582, as we are told by someone called I.G., that they're all complaining at the time that the modern playwrights in the late 16th century are being absolutely disgraceful because they're invoking the Greek god Pallas Athena, who was born from the head of Zeus shaking a spear, and it was her will that shook a spear. She actually...
Jonathan respond?
Shakespeare, like many things in Shakespeare, is a lovely, witty joke at his own expense. Indeed, it's a joke he enjoyed so much that he went along to the herald's office in order to get a coat of arms for his family so they could call themselves gentlemen, and chose to have a diagonal spear on his coat of arms. And then one of the officers in the herald's officer wrote on the application for the coat of arms complaining that Shakespeare, the player, was applying for a coat of arms. Another of the heralds came back and said, no, Shakespeare came from a very respectable family in Stratford-upon-Avon. His mother was Mary Arden, who was related to the Ardens, who were an important family. And that man who defended Shakespeare the player, Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, was called William Camden, who a year after that wrote a book in which he said that William Shakespeare was one of the greatest writers of the time. It's a very important piece of evidence, that.
I've got a man desperate to answer this here.
Yeah, what we've just heard there is that someone has a coat of arms that resembles his name. That's called canting. That's very common indeed. We were also told that a man called Camden says over here that William Shakespeare was a great writer, and over here calls him the player. Very important. He obviously sees them as two different people. I'm sure we're all aware here that there's an extremely famous actor in Canada who goes by the name of Graham Greene. The suggestion here, I think, as I understand it, if I'm clear, is that if I write over here about Graham Greene, jolly interesting Canadian actor, and then I write over here about the English novelist, the assumption is that I assume that Graham Greene, the Canadian actor, wrote Our Man in Havana. Well, that's obviously nonsense, and I don't, and they're two different people, and Camden was very aware of that. And the important thing about Camden, very important, is Camden wrote a history of Britain, and he went to all the places in Britain, and he noticed Stratford-upon-Avon, and he writes about Stratford-upon-Avon, and he said it's a little market town that owes all its consequence to two people. And they are John de Stratford, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Hugh Clopton. Whoops, who's missing?
Thank you.
Whereas others visited Stratford as early as 1618, 1623, and 1626, and said that this town is famous for one reason, because the famous William Shakespeare, the great writer, came from there.
I'll send you stuff. No. You cannot invent stuff. That's naughty. Naughty.
Alexander.
Not inventing.
I will email you those references tomorrow.
What date?
1618, 1623. Well, before 1623, because it was published in 1623, and another one, a manuscript where the hand belongs to the 1620s. I'll send you the references tomorrow.
I want them on my desk by tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock.
They'll be there.
We only have time for 3 more questions, I'm sorry. So who is a burning issue? Could we get a microphone to this lady here, who's been wanting to ask for a long time?
In the plays of William Shakespeare, there seems to me to be such a great love of women because he writes women so well. And even in The Taming of the Shrew, there are examples of women being educated by tutors in the scenes. I wonder, how do you reconcile the fact that William Shakespeare didn't educate his daughter? Because there's an example of her writing where she signs her name with an X, which would suggest she doesn't know how to write even her own name.
Thank you.
Many, interestingly, many people who could sign their names did only sign with an X. So that's not evidence that she was illiterate. The important thing to remember about Susanna is that she was married to a very learned doctor, and on her tomb it says she was a woman of great wit. Wit means intelligence, means a kind of literariness. As of great a wit as her father. As
Alexander,
of great a wit
would you
as
answer
her father.
On the daughter,
so,
sorry. Very briefly on the daughters. Very interesting in The Tempest, we have Prospero, enormous pride he takes in the fact that he's educated his daughter Miranda. We have William Shakespeare of Stratford's daughter, Judith, who signs her name in a little mark. The father, John, signs his name in a mark. The mother can't write. The daughter, Susanna, is visited by a man called James Cook, who is embarrassed because she can't recognize her husband's writing. We have a pedigree here, an extraordinary pedigree that goes illiterate, greatest writer in the world, illiterate. I'm sorry. You don't have to come from a literary family, but I don't buy that, no.
Thank you. At the back, a question, please. Thank you.
Yeah, Jonathan, I'd like to ask you a question going back to the will that you mentioned, that Enoch Powell, who was a classical philologist, as you know, was a Shakespeare of Stratford doubter, and he points to the will and he says that the names of Henning and Condell that connects the will to the first folio have been interpolated into the will. And while we're on Powell, Powell, as you probably know, is the grandson, or you may know, is the grandson of a scrap metal merchant and so forth. So it's not quite right that whereas Alexander and the Waughs might be interested in love and Aristocrat, I don't think that Enoch Powell was coming from the perspective of doubting Stratford on snobbish grounds alone.
Scholars have examined Shakespeare's will for a long, long time, for more, 100 years, 200 years. There are interleavings in the will. In particular, the famous second best bed is an interleaving. But there is absolutely no evidence that the Hemmings-Condell-Burbage bequest is interleaved. I'm afraid Powell, great man, but he was simply wrong about that.
No, it's not interleaved, is the wrong word. What it is an interlineal. What he's written is between the lines, and we don't need to argue about that. It's written in between the lines. And when you write something in between the lines of a will, then you should endorse it, and there are no endorsements on these things. Now, I'm not saying that Shakespeare of Stratford, I'm absolutely confident that Shakespeare of Stratford did have connections to Hemmings. Hemmings was someone who weighed coal and weighed wool and stuff, and they were businessmen and they were investing in theatre. I'm not denying that. But to say that we absolutely know that the will wasn't tampered with, I think is a little bit dangerous. And I'll give you one piece of evidence that I think is very strong, namely that William Shakespeare of Stratford had a friend called Hamnet Sadler, and Hamnet Sadler's wife was called Judith. And we know they were great friends, and Shakespeare of Stratford called his two twins after them, Judith and Hamnet. Hamnet signs the will, Hamnet Sadler, as an executor of that will, and someone, and the name Hamnet is in the text because he's left something, and someone has overwritten where it says Hamnet and put an L to say Hamlet to make it sound a bit more like Shakespeare. So I do think there is some evidence which needs to be taken reasonably seriously that somebody has tampered with that will. Now, I'm not going to say I'm saying it's all a fraud, obviously, but that is some evidence that needs to be properly assessed and not just thrown aside and said, yeah. It's a problem. It's a problem.
Hamlet and Hamnet are indeed variant spellings.
Well, the Prince of... I never heard the Prince of Denmark call himself Hamnet.
Sadler, there are documents in the Stratford records where Hamnet Sadler is Hamnet Sadler and other ones where he's Hamlet Sadler.
Yes, and I wonder why. And this is exactly what I'm asking. Well, who's put those L's over the top of the N's? This is the problem.
A final question. Thank you. May we have the microphone to the nearest point. And then we're going to move to a vote. So please consider your positions.
Not having a sum up first?
And then a summing up.
After vote?
After the vote?
Okay.
Happy? Okay. Would you prefer to go before?
No, I'm happy. Whatever Jonathan wants.
Thank you. What was your question?
Well, I thought the debate was who wrote Shakespeare. And Alexander Waugh, I came to hear you make the case for who wrote Shakespeare. You are the leading Oxfordian, and no. I believe a leading Oxfordian, and I haven't heard anything about if Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, who did? The only reason for asking that question is you have a good alternative candidate. No one says who wrote Homer. There is no alternative. Obviously, there is an alternative candidate, and I think you have chickened out, Alexander, of making the case for Oxford, and that makes me think the case for Oxford is weak.
Okay, can I answer that since it was addressed to me? I'm very happy for you to think the case for Oxford is weak, if that's what you want to think, because I haven't presented the case for Oxford. You can think what you like about it. The simple fact of the matter is I had no idea who was going to be in the audience tonight, and there are some people for whom the Shakespeare authorship question is a very new thing. Now, we have sentiment and tradition on the side of Shakespeare of Stratford that goes back many, many years, and for many people it's very difficult to be told the sentiment and tradition that you've had for many years is actually wrong, the facts are wrong, and I tell you what, this guy did it all in the same night. You could see the problem I had in my first 15 minutes, just the lack of time to show the huge amount of evidence that Stratford Shakespeare is wrong. To add on top of that Oxford, I just didn't think it was going to work. And I've said, and I'll say for the last time, I'm very happy to come back here. I will more than happy, after this debate, to do an Oxford debate and really hammer that one home, because it's a great case, and thank you.
Sorry? Oxford is a key moment this evening.
Well, I have to say, that's our title. The De Vere Society are out in force. They've left bits of paper on the seats. They're selling their books in the foyer.
Well, maybe, Jonathan, there's been a misunderstanding because, I was of the very clear opinion that the motion of this debate was William Shakespeare of Stratford did not write a single play or poem. That's my understanding of the motion. That's exactly what I've been doing. This is what I was told by the... So I don't know what this is. Who did that? Come clean. Who's guilty?
But I do think let's come back to the rules of evidence, the principle of Occam's razor. You can really only start a counter-argument if you've got a good alternative case, because all the evidence from the period, all those people at the time, such as Leonard Digges, such as George Buck, who associate Shakespeare with the plays, the idea that it wasn't him only comes later when people start fantasizing about cryptograms and hidden codes and conspiracies.
This is a move towards the summing up, and I want to hear you continue with your argument. First, I would like Sir Jonathan Bate to sum up his argument for 3 minutes, and then we will move to Alexander Waugh.
I don't think I'm going to take 3 minutes, because I just want to say something very, very, very simple, which is that in the end, everybody has a distinctive linguistic register. And as I said before, one of the things that I think the authorship debate has been very good at is really getting people working in a much more sophisticated way on the authorship of the plays in the period. This used to be done impressionistically. The first person who thought that the Earl of Oxford wrote the works of Shakespeare was a delightful Edwardian schoolmaster called J. Thomas Looney, who was convinced...
Many say
please don't interrupt,
Looney.
it's extremely rude. Who was convinced that Delia Bacon was wrong, but still convinced that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. So he started reading plays and poems by other people from the time to try to find who was Shakespeare. And he alighted on the poems of the Earl of Oxford, and in an impressionistic way thought he saw similarities with Shakespeare. Now, what has happened 100 years on is that the entire corpus of poetic and dramatic literature of the age of Shakespeare has been put onto databases so that we can now work out authorship in a much, much more sophisticated, more nuanced way. Almost scene by scene, we can see how playwrights are collaborating with each other. Everybody has their own linguistic fingerprint. And that seems to me to be an enormously valuable tool. But there is still work to be done. There are plays around the fringes of the canon that we still don't know to what extent they have a little bit of Shakespeare as well as someone else. It now looks as though it was Shakespeare, not Ben Jonson, who wrote the wonderful additional mad scenes in the revision of Kidd's Spanish tragedy. Hieronymo being mad again, Sir Mark or Sir Derek would be absolutely wonderful playing those scenes. And they, as actors, although they have their doubts, they, I think, in their gut would know this is not Kidd. This is not Jonson, this is Shakespeare. So I just want to leave you with, to remind you that of the 600 surviving plays from the period, the only ones to mention the counties of Warwickshire and Gloucestershire, and of course Stratford is on the border of Gloucestershire, and if you read the scene in Justice Shallow's Orchard, you have to know that's written by a Cotswold man. And then also this, that this local dialect, In inventories of manuscript inventories of people from Stratford upon Avon, a cake of wax is called a quiche. Shakespeare uses that word. There's a distinctive term called cradle cloth in which to wrap an infant. Shakespeare uses that word. Down, a soft feather, is dowl rather than down. Shakespeare uses dowl. Dairy is day, D-E-Y. Shakespeare uses that word. It's that kind of little minute local detail that means that much as I love the debate, I have no doubt William of Stratford was the man.
Thank you. And
Okay, this is a summing up, so I'll try and make it a summing up. But I did notice that Jonathan introduced a little bit of extra information there, so I'll just quickly squash that one. Ros Barber, who's a very, very clever scholar, has written an enormously long essay in the Journal of Early Modern Studies. Stratfordians love to say that Shakespeare used Warwickshire words. He didn't actually. That's what's called wishful thinking or special pleading. Shakespeare used 31,000 different words, of which 20 have been identified by certain Stratfordians as belonging to Warwickshire. Ros Barber went through every single one of those 20, one after the other, and showed quite clearly that they were used by people long before Shakespeare. They had nothing to do with Warwickshire or anything to do with anything at all. So I'm afraid I'm not going to accept that. But I don't want to do this is rebuttal and something. I'm meant to be doing a summing up. So let's actually just try to sum up for a second. Jonathan brought up the matter of a man who he thinks is hysterically funny that he was called Looney. Very unfortunate if you're born with a name called Looney, and most people would be kind and nice to someone who's called Looney. But never mind. Jonathan's called Bate, so I'm sure he's had some suffering occasionally. Now, while he tries to squash Looney and give that sort of impression that any single person who's an anti-Stratfordian is a loony, I only need to remind you that some of the greatest people in the history of our world and our thought and our culture have doubted William Shakespeare of Stratford, Walt Whitman, who's probably the greatest American poet, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who surely is one of the greatest essayists, Henry James, who's one of the cleverest novelists ever existed, Orson Welles, our own Shakespearean actors, Sir Mark Rylance, Sir Derek Jacobi, Sir John Gielgud. These are people who really understand Shakespeare. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, says it's all rubbish. Guess who else is an anti-Stratfordian? One of our greatest poets, Ted Hughes. Did that appear in Jonathan's biography? No, whoops, he swept it under the carpet. What about Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, John Paul Stevens, Supreme Court Justice? We're talking about the highest lawyers in the whole of the free world. Now, anyone whose mind is capable of thinking independently will see the evidence for what it is. Overwhelming, and will reach the same conclusion as so many great minds when faced with the same evidence, namely that William of Stratford could not possibly have written those plays. Now, unfortunately, we know that an independent mind is not given to everyone. However, I'm confident this evening there are enough people in this room with an independent mind who can jump outside that little box of sentiment and tradition and vote to pass this motion. Thank you.
thank you. And so, the judgment moment, a final vote, please. If you believe that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, would you raise your hand now? Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, exactly. Thank you. 78. I think they've remained loyal to their faith. Who believes that someone else wrote the work? That is a strong majority. It was 107 when we came in, and it possibly is a few more now. Who of the don't knows, the 86 don't knows amongst us, who now would go for Shakespeare? Shakespeare writing Shakespeare? Some, I would say maybe 10. And who of the don't knows would now think someone else wrote Shakespeare? Just about, no, One man, one vote, or one woman, one vote. I think around the same. So in a moment of concord to end this fraught and fascinating evening, we're all brought here by our love of Shakespeare, and now we have basically a tie, which is a wonderful, in terms of the numbers. Thank you.